Hey guys, so I'm sure you're all sick of Dragon Link by now, and the deck probably finally gets hit on the next ban list, but before we get there, I did want to break down what kind of board that they set up and their win percentages based on what they set up by looking at the replays of the top ranked players to show how strong this deck is. Now, a couple of months ago, I made another analytical video on Dragon Link in terms of which hand traps had a good win percentage against this deck, so make sure to check that out as well. So let's just get started. To start off, of course, since I am breaking down the Dragon Link's turn 1 board, I only looked at games where the Dragon Link player went first. Speaking of turn 1 board, I also only looked at the board presence at the end of the first turn. So for example, did they end on Seal and Savage? Now the exception is that for Levianeer, all I was looking for is if they successfully hand ripped on turn 1, it did not actually have to stay on the field after that. As for Dragonmaid Tidying, I counted it as an interruption if it was actually live, as in the Dragon Link player actually controlled a dragon monster on the field. Now I did not look at whether any of these monsters or traps were present beyond turn 1, partly for simplicity, but also because as opponents going up against Dragon Link, we are primarily just focused on what they can set up on their first turn to see if we even have a chance of beating them. Of course, this deck is quite grindy, and even if they didn't do much on turn 1, they can totally turn it up on subsequent turns, and the overall win percentages that I'm going to show you will probably reflect that. So the cards I counted as part of Dragon Link's turn 1 board included Hieratic Seal of the Heavenly Spheres, Dragonmaid Tidying, Borreload Savage, Chaos Dragon Levianeer, Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss, and Apollousa, Bow of the Goddess. I did also consider what other hand traps or Dragon Link players may have had in addition to these cards as well, at least for part of my analysis. So let's start with some overall numbers. So I usually look at the top 75 ranked players on Dueling Book for these deck specific analysis, but for Dragon Link, I actually only had to look up the top 15 players to get at least 200 games, which is sort of the figure that I always want to hit. Among the top 15 ranked players on Dueling Book at the time that I did my data collection, 11 of them played Dragon Link, so that's what this video is based on. In the games where the players went first, they won 82% of the time. There was a total of 232 games included, but among these games, 22, or almost 10%, were games where the opponent just scooped before the Dragon Link player could end their turn and set up their board. Obviously, because the Dragon Link player was about to set up a strong board, so the opponent just scooped, but sadly, because I could not know for sure what the Dragon Link player would set up, I had to exclude these games. This means that the values you see throughout the video will slightly underestimate how strong Dragon Link is because these games were excluded. So now let's see how many interruptions that the Dragon Link player could set up on their turn 1. Keep in mind that the values you see here do not include any additional hand traps that the Dragon Link player may have actually had as well, although I'll cover that later. This is just looking at the 6 cards I mentioned earlier, like the Seal, Tidying, Savage, Levy, Red, and Apollousa. As for Apollousa, generally it would be a 3 material apple, but I counted it as just 1 interruption for these graphs, because I'm more so focused on the number of unique interruptions set up. Apollousa was not actually summoned that much anyway, so it would not have changed much either way. So you see here that about 50% of the time, the Dragon Link player set up at least 3 of the interruptions on turn 1. Now keep in mind that this is just for turn 1. Dragon Link players don't necessarily vomit out everything on turn 1, but may bring out different interruptions throughout multiple turns. You do see that 15% of the time they actually set up nothing, which is higher than I thought. They may have been hand trapped by the opponent or just bricked with their own hand traps or maybe side cards. But as I mentioned earlier, because I am excluding those 22 games where the opponent just scooped, these board presence values would actually look a little better in reality. Now if we were to look at the win percentage based on the number of interruptions that they set up in turn 1, you see that of course having set up nothing led to the lowest win percentage at 45%. Now setting up 1 to 2 interruptions on turn 1, you still saw them win about 71 to 77% of the time, which is still quite high. I think this just shows that Dragon Link is far beyond what they can set up turn 1, even though they are of course capable of setting up a very intimidating board. But even if they only set up a Seal for turn 1 because let's say they got hit by a Dimension Shifter, if you don't actually kill them the next turn, they can easily explode and just bring out everything at that point. So just because you only see them set up something small for turn 1, don't let your guard down and think that you will win that game. Now the insane thing is that if they set up 3 interruptions for turn 1, they won 96% of the time, and this increases even more slightly with 4 interruptions. Funnily enough, you see the win percentage dip a little to 89% at 5 or more interruptions. Now I'm not sure if this is because of the small sample size or if it's perhaps because investing too much into turn 1 can actually lead to a lower win percentage than saving some of your resources. I'd be curious to know what the Dragon Link players think about this. So up until now I was looking at the number of interruptions based on those 6 cards I mentioned, But if we were to also include hand traps into the mix, so for example, let's say our Dragon Link players drew into Ashe and or Nibiru on top of their typical Dragon Link board, then the number of interruptions of course will become higher. As you can see here, to have no interruptions, even including no hand traps drawn, happen only 4% of the time. Now you have 25% of games where the Dragon Link players went first and had at least 5 or more interruptions at the end of their turn 1, with their end board plus any potential hand traps. And if you look at the win percentage again based on the number of these interruptions, you see a similar trend with increasing win rate for each additional interruption, although again, you do see that slight dip at the end when you have too many interruptions. Now the other part that makes Dragon Link so strong is how resilient they are and how they can set up a board through hand traps. So let's take a closer look at that. When the Dragon Link players' opponents did not activate any hand traps on their turn 1, then this is the number of interruptions that they set up. Again, this does not include any hand traps that the Dragon Link player themselves may have actually had, but just those 6 cards of Seal, Tidying, Savage, Levy, Hot Red, and or Apollousa. So even with no hand traps by the opponent, the Dragon Link player surprisingly did not set up anything 14% of those games where they went first. Of course, they may have had at least some hand traps though. But for the most part, you see that 68% of the time, the Dragon Link player set up at least 3 interruptions on turn 1 when they did not get hand trapped. Now let's see the board setup when the opponent activated one hand trap, and of course not all hand traps have equal weight in terms of impact, but that's hard to measure. Also, even if the opponent activated a hand trap and the Dragon Link player used Call by the Grave, I still counted that as a hand trap being played for this section because after all, it was still an attempt made with a hand trap, but the Dragon Link player just played through it. So when the opponent had one hand trap that they activated in that turn 1, the Dragon Link player still set up a pretty good board as you can see here. Of course, the number of 0 interruptions went slightly up, but still, 41% of the time, the Dragon Link player still set up at least 3 interruptions. And remember, earlier in the video I showed that when the Dragon Link player set up 3 interruptions for example, they won 96% of those games. So now let's look at it by when the opponent activated 2 or more hand traps. We no longer see the Dragon Link player set up 4 or more interruptions in these scenarios, but still, almost a quarter of the time they were still able to set up 3 interruptions even through multiple hand traps. You can also see it as 59% of the time they still set up 2 interruptions on turn 1, whether it be Seal and Savage or whatever, through multiple hand traps, and I think that just shows how resilient this deck is. Now the crazy thing is that this is not even including whether other hand traps that the Dragon Link players themselves may have had as well. Even crazier, remember we are slightly underestimating what the Dragon Link players set up because we are excluding those games where the opponent just scooped. Not to mention, this is only looking at what they set up for turn 1. They could easily just explode in subsequent turns instead if they did not set up something strong at the start of the game. Okay, so now let's try to focus on some of the Dragon Link endboard cards more specifically, starting with Hieratic Seal. This was present at the end of turn 1 about 72% of the time. Now let's say that the Dragon Link player summoned Seal at some point in turn 1, and then it got Nibiru'd, and then they ended the turn on something like Savage and Tidying instead. In that instance, it would be flagged as not having Seal for turn 1 since they did not actually end on it, so keep that in mind. Now with the graph here, you see that when the Dragon Link player set up 0 interruptions, they only won 45% of the games, and this is the same value you saw at the beginning of this video, so this is going to serve as a reference point. Also, keep in mind that this again does not consider whether the Dragon Link player had any hand traps. This is just whether or not they set up any of the 6 cards that I considered as a Dragon Link end board. Now if the Dragon Link player set up at least 1 interruption that was not Hieratic Seal at the end of turn 1, then they won 82% of those games. But in games where they did have Seal at the end of turn 1, whether by itself or along with other interruptions, they won 88% of those games. So it seems like it likely has an influence on doing better. Of course, this is a simplistic analysis, and it may well be that another card that happens to be alongside whenever Seal is summoned that is actually causing this difference in win percentage. So just keep that in mind that this is all pretty rudimentary. Next up is Tidying, which was live at the end of turn 1, about 63% of the time. I say live because the Dragon Link player had to control a dragon monster on the field for it to be considered as having Tidying. As for the win percentage, you see that if they had any other interruption set up at the end of turn 1 other than a live Tidying, then they won just 68% of the time, whereas if they did have a live Tidying, they won 93% of the time. Certainly a big gap in win percentage, and numbers aside, I think by now we know how important Tidying is. The bounce is really strong, yes, but it also serves as an extender because you can banish it from the grave to special out Chamber Dragonmaid for that extra body, which then of course searches another Tidying. So overall, a really key card in Dragon Link. Then we have Borreload Savage, which surprisingly was only summoned 36% of the time on turn 1, although I did notice it being summoned a lot on turn 2 and subsequent turns, so overall in a game it does get summoned a lot more. Interestingly though, if the Dragon Link player set up other interruptions other than Savage, the win percentage for that game was pretty much the exact same as whether they had Savage, either on its own or along with any other interruption. Not to say that it's not a good card of course, but maybe the other cards that the Dragon Link player set up are just as good. Next we have whether the Dragon Link player Levianeer hand ripped on turn 1, and for Levy, it did not actually have to stay on board at the end of turn 1. I only considered whether it hand ripped or not, and surprisingly, it only happened 34% of the time on turn 1. But like Savage, I did notice that the Levy hand rip actually happened quite a lot on turn 2 instead if they did not do it on the first turn, so keep that in mind. If the Dragon Link player set up interruptions other than Levy, they won 83% of the time, whereas successfully hand ripping for 1 on turn 1 with Levy meant that they won 92% of the time. So certainly seems to push the win rate to higher levels with this card, and not surprising since even ripping just one card is usually really impactful. And lastly, I am going to cover Hot Red, which was summoned the least amount of times at 30%. When the Dragon Link player set up something other than Hot Red, they won an impressive 85% of the time, but when they did have Hot Red, the win percentage was at an even more impressive 90%. I don't know if this actually means anything because I kinda thought Savage was better since it is an Omni negate, whereas Hot Red can only negate cards on the field. At the same time, Hot Red does provide a unique advantage against cards like Dark Ruler or Forbidden Droplet, because if the opponent has a card engraved, then you can chain Tidying and then chain Hot Red's effect to negate Dark Ruler or Droplet. But I can't say that this happened many times though. Now I'm not going to cover Apollousa just because most players did not seem to run it, and it just did not come up that often. Alright guys, so that was it for my analysis of Dragon Link's turn 1 board. Hope you found that interesting, and if you did, please consider sharing this video to your fellow Yu-Gi-Oh friends so that I can grow my audience, and don't forget to subscribe. I do plan on analyzing Tri-Brigade and Drytron within the next month, so stay tuned. Take care guys.